It's The Real Deal with me, George Galloway, on Press TV. Oliver, welcome to The Real Deal. I need some help here from you. I fly a lot, though most of it's not for pleasure. I have a hybrid car, low-energy light bulbs. I don't leave taps running. I switch off computers and TV at night. But it all just seems so little in the sea of climate troubles that we have. You've got a plan for Kyoto 2. Indeed, you've written a book about it. But Kyoto 1 was a bit of a damp squib. Tell us why.
Well, Kyoto 1, I think the world wasn't really aware of the urgency of what needed to be done and the scale of what needed to be done. You know, they'd realised, yes, global warming is a problem, but they hadn't realised how big a problem or how fast it would come on. Now we do realise how big a problem and how fast it will come on, but we have a system that was not designed for those particular circumstances. And so Kyoto 1 was very much about creating a system of carbon trading, for example, and it's done that. You know, it's created a global carbon market, which is a big business for those involved. It has set targets for reductions, but what we're finding is that these reductions targets simply aren't big enough. Large parts of the world are excluded from having to meet any targets, essentially the developing world, and of course it's the fast industrializing developing countries where emissions are rising fastest. And carbon trading may be a great idea, but it doesn't seem to be delivering significant reductions in emissions. And the entire system is also fantastically complex, and that means that it's exclusive. It means that it's exclusive even to smaller countries who can't afford massive delegations and so on. It's very hard to participate. It's very hard for civil society to participate, and that tends to put a block on progress because it's so difficult to work out what's actually happening and what it all means.
And how damaging was George Bush's refusal to join?
Well, I think it was damaging in that it basically slowed the entire process down. Perhaps the most damaging thing is that it meant that there was a highly polarized debate about Kyoto yes or no. And of course the environmentalists all said yes and the skeptics all said no. And that means that the environmental groups put a lot of weight behind Kyoto. But in fact, when you look at it, and the fact it is a largely ineffective mechanism, in a way it drew the environmental groups into somewhere where they shouldn't have been, which is supporting Kyoto, when really they should have been opposing it, but for the complete opposite reasons that George Bush was opposing it.
So Kyoto 2 is necessary. You've written a marvellous new book about it. Tell us your thesis, how the planet can be saved by a new Kyoto.
Well, the principle of Kyoto 2 is that you have a global cap. So the cap applies to the entire world, the cap on
emissions.
Emissions. So instead of just applying to some countries, or indeed any individual country at all, it applies to the entire world. And you sell permits to pollute up to that cap through an auction process. Now, the controls on greenhouse gas emissions are actually done upstream, and that means primarily at the point of production of fossil fuels. And so you go to a point in the production chain of fossil fuels where the flows are highly concentrated, and that might be, for example, oil refineries, because all oil has to go through oil refineries, and it's easily measured at that point. And so you then levy the permits from the fossil fuel companies against their production, reflecting the emissions that will take place downstream when those fossil fuels are burnt. And so it means that you're in effect controlling and limiting the production of greenhouse gases at the point where the fossil fuels come into the economy. And it's simply a much cheaper and much more effective way of doing it than looking at the point where the greenhouse gases are emitted.
How would you punish the production of emissions that were not auctioned for and not within the cap?
Well, it would simply be illegal, and the responsibility for enforcement would reside with national governments. But one of the principles here is that you simply wouldn't be able to buy fossil fuels that had not been through this process. And it's very much like the system that we have in the UK for taxing fuel, alcohol, cigarettes. Obviously there is some smuggling, but it's a small part of the market as a whole. Basically anywhere that you go to buy beer, whiskey, it has already been taxed. And so it would be exactly the same with fossil fuels, that the tax having been put in place upstream, it would already have been taxed.
And how likely is your thesis to come to pass? Is it held to be a very radical set of propositions?
Well, Ivo de Boer made a comment at a recent meeting, which is that he actually thinks it's the way that we should go. Ivo de Boer, as being the Secretary General of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, he said that he sees it as being the way of going in the future. And one reason that he gave is because it shifts the debate from one about burden sharing, which is what we've got at the moment, to one about how to share out benefits. Because one important thing I didn't mention before is that this auction would raise about $1,000 billion per year. And that's money that you can put into developing climate solutions. So that's things like investing heavily in renewable energy, especially in developing countries, conserving forests, spending on the kind of adaptation countries need to do to make themselves resilient against drought, sea level rise, flooding, and all these consequences of climate change. And so that is really quite a substantial fund, big enough to really tackle the problems seriously, and which would mainly go into developing countries. And I think that they will see a considerable benefit in that, but actually everybody gets a benefit, because everybody gets the benefit, if it goes ahead, that the really catastrophic consequences of climate change are avoided. And so, so ultimately it is a win-win, and for that reason, I mean, I don't expect it to happen at the Copenhagen conference in December, but I very much hope that the negotiators, the governments, the NGOs present will actually take this system on board and see it as the way of the future beyond Copenhagen to deliver the kind of greenhouse gas reductions and wider changes in the world that we need.
Have you routed the skeptics now? Are they just noises off?
I think there are probably skeptics who take themselves very seriously, but I think that increasingly the skeptics are not taken seriously. But in fact, I mean, the entire debate is in a way a stupid one to even get involved in, because most of the things that you would do need doing anyway, even if there is no such thing as climate change as a result of, of our greenhouse gas emissions, which seems to me, I have to say, deeply improbable. We are still faced with a crisis in fossil fuel energy supplies,
so it's worth doing anyway.
To deal with. So it's worth doing anyway.
Well, Oliver, thank you very much indeed. That's it, I'm afraid, for another week. I've been George Galloway. This has been Press TV's Real Deal. See you next week, God willing. Same time, same place. Until then, go in peace.